Greetings once again, friends, and live from Retro Central. My name is Peter. Welcome back to Consolation. As always, I'm glad that you've taken the time to check out my work. I sincerely hope that you'll enjoy what you're about to see and hear. Let's flash back to 1998. In 1998, I got my first video game retail job, working as an assistant manager for Funcoland in West Springfield, Massachusetts. It was an awesome second half of 1998 for me. I had just gotten out of a really tough part of my life, and things were looking up. Working with video games, after all, was going to be a huge deal. Video games, probably more than anything else, were things that I knew about upside down and inside out. I had campaigned really hard for this job, and I was thrilled to get started. While working there, we got a demo disc at one point for some game called Metal Gear Solid. You've probably heard of it, and that's what's playing on the GX next to me. Now, I was not at all interested in Metal Gear Solid when my manager first put the demo in. I really didn't care at all, because Metal Gear is a game about stealth, which is a kind of game that goes against all of my gameplay sensibilities. Knowing me as you probably do, I'm more of an arcade guy. It takes 15 to 30 seconds to get into a game and to go. There's not a lot of slow pacing, there's not a lot of planning involved. You kind of do all the strategizing before you start, and you take off and you run. But with Metal Gear Solid, it's a bit different, because if you move too fast, you're going to get spotted. If you get spotted, you get overwhelmed with soldiers, or in some instances, your game can end just like that. So I had no interest, but I would watch my manager play the demo on occasion, and he would get into it. And what drew me in wasn't the gameplay per se, but was the crazy story. Story of this lone wolf who was infiltrating this facility all by himself with a backup team on the radio. And while trying to not be seen, it turns out that the story winds up going south, and he doesn't know half of what's going on. So when we finally got the final copy of the game in, when we got retail copies in, one of the things that we could do at Funcoland was open a copy for display. And that's exactly what we did. We opened a copy for people to be able to try if they wanted, and during downtime, in which there was quite a bit because we were a new store, Justin and I took turns playing the game and working our way through it. And gradually I fell in love with it. The gameplay, something I still really had a tough time with until I bought the game eventually for myself and played it through a couple of times. But the story, the way it was told, the voice work, the music, the setting, all absolutely fantastic. And so, as I said, I bought the game, and I played it from stem to stern, and then I played it again, and I played it a third time, unlocking all of the little Easter eggs and treats that go along with it, like unlimited ammo and such. And I became a fan of the game. So much of a fan, in fact, that when VR Missions came out a year later, I bought that as well, because it was more Metal Gear, and it was really, to steal a oft-used term from lazy game reviews, it's a practice mode more than anything else, of learning how to use the weapons, learning how to go hand-to-hand, and most importantly, learning how to move around more stealthily, which is something that I always struggled with. I did it just well enough to get through the game, but was never a pro at it. So VR Missions, even though you could argue that it really should have been an extension of the first game, was still, to me, worth the purchase. And I played a lot of this. My favorite memory of this was when we got it in, and I was now a manager of a Funcoland store. My DM, my district manager, came in one day, and we would have contests as to who would fare better on each of the stages while there was downtime. And I loved that. It was as much competitive as it was practice, going for the high scores, going for the top 3, as well as unlocking certain things in the game. So a lot of people tend to poo-poo on VR Missions, and I can understand that, but for me, I enjoyed it quite a bit. So some time passed, and I moved from the PlayStation to the Dreamcast, and Metal Gear was kind of just something that was there. I would play it every once in a while just to see if I could get through the game, but I really didn't think anything of the sequel because it was for the PlayStation 2. And up until 2001, I wasn't a PlayStation 2 guy. I had been heavily committed to the Dreamcast and really wasn't paying attention to the Metal Gear Solid sequel. But when I did get a PlayStation 2 in 2001, later in that year, as I started writing for websites, writing reviews for websites, Metal Gear Solid 2 was one of my assignments. Here's Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. This was the first game and the first review that I was ever held to a deadline for, which was exceptionally difficult. My mission, whether I chose to accept it or not, was to buy the game because we didn't get review copies at the time, play through the game as quickly as possible, and then turn around a review on it. So that was difficult. When you're up against the clock, knowing that you're trying to get a review done in a timely fashion, and at the same time, the game was a bit more challenging than Metal Gear Solid was, even at its easier setting. But I enjoyed this just the same, even though the story is bat crap crazy in spots, and that's kind of Hideo Kojima's calling card, is going above and beyond with his storyline and his characters. But at the same time, having them in kind of like real-life settings where they're almost believable but not quite, this game really stuck out to me. Now, of course, with Metal Gear Solid 2, the argument always falls upon, well, what's the deal with Raiden, and why is Solid Snake only good for the first 1/2 or even 40% of the game? But that never really bothered me. And perhaps that's because I was only a Metal Gear Solid fan and not necessarily a fan of the Metal Gear series throughout. Solid Snake to me didn't make the game per se, although he was the protagonist. He was a part of the overarching story and the collection of characters that made the game as interesting as it was, and the story as interesting as it was. So I don't dislike the game as much as a lot of other people do. This game gets a lot of either like it or hate it within the video game community, but for me, I thought it was okay. I like the fact that it was 60 frames a second instead of 30, so it looked better, it sounded better. With Harry Gregson Williams doing the soundtrack, it sounded great. I was always confused as to whether the cutscenes were CGI or whether they were done within the engine itself. And it was to me, a lot of fun to play. Tougher, I thought, than the first game, but still fun to play. So Metal Gear Solid 2 might be the redheaded stepchild of the four main games in the Metal Gear Solid franchise, but to me, still stands out as a pretty good game. This is where I'm going to get a lot of disagreement. In, I forget what year this was, but sometime later came Metal Gear Solid 3. Snake Eater was a trip backwards, a prequel, if you will. And all of the things that I knew, about Metal Gear Solid and Metal Gear Solid 2 with the Soliton radar and kind of knowing where you were changed because radar wasn't as much a thing as camouflage was, and the idea of survival and eating and catching animals. And I had a difficult time coming to grips with the Cold War storyline as well. I know a lot of people praise this game, especially the boss battles. For me, after all this time, I still have not been able to get into it, and it's the only one of the 4 main Metal Gear Solid games that I have not finished. I beat the first game in '98, I beat the second game in 2001, I beat Metal Gear Solid 4 in, I believe it was 2008, but this game, I never could finish. I've tried multiple times to pick it up and to play it, but when I believe it's to, I think it's whoever the sniper is in the trees in the forest, and I forget because I haven't even started playing the game again in a long time. Once I get there, I get frustrated with that battle and I just give up. I decide to just stop playing because there's nothing to really push me along. The only thing that pushes me along in this game is just hoping that the story gets better, but it's just not enough of a push, not enough to get me to keep playing. So those are the main games. Of course, there's Metal Gear Solid 4 for the PS3, which I no longer have because I traded in my PS3 towards my PS4, which is in the office. Metal Gear Solid 4, of course, with its callbacks to the earlier games in the series, is the reason why I enjoyed it a lot. Plus, it's a game that you didn't necessarily have to play stealthy. You did have multiple options if you wanted to play the game more guns blazing than sneaking around. And stealth has never been my thing. So I appreciated that a lot. Then, of course, there's the callback to Shadow Moses Island, which absolutely drew me in with the callbacks to the original Metal Gear Solid. And memories, of course, just came flashing back to 1998 and playing the game for the first time. So I thought that was really, really neat. But now we've come to a crossroads. Metal Gear Solid 5 is on its way, should be out in September. It marks the end of the Hideo Kojima partnership or relationship with Konami. Both will be parting ways after the game comes out. There's been a very loud falling out between both parties to where Hideo Kojima's name has been stricken from the front of the Metal Gear Solid 5 packaging. Rumors about the head of Konami and Hideo Kojima not seeing eye to eye. And honestly, that's a big disappointment to me. It has nothing to do with whether I'm going to buy the game or not, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But after all the work that Kojima put in on all of those titles, and with as successful as they had been, between those and the less popular but still cult following based Zone of the Enders games, Kojima did a lot for that company and really kept them big, despite the fact that a lot of their other flagship franchises, your Contras, your Castlevanias, were starting to fade into the distance. Metal Gear Solid was always there to keep the company at the forefront of discussion. Whenever there was anything Metal Gear Solid mentioned, everyone's ears would perk up. There would be interest. And now, who knows what's going to happen with that? Metal Gear Solid stays with Konami. Kojima, the man who created it, created all the characters, and really came up with a lot of the scenarios, he's gone. So we'll have to see what happens from that point on. Interestingly enough, Metal Gear Solid 5 will be the first game in the series that I don't buy, and it has nothing to do really with the fact that Kojima and Konami are going through this ugly divorce. But meanwhile, if you've played Ground Zeroes, it's much more open-ended. It's a much more open-world sandbox kind of stealth game than the other Metal Gear Solid games were. And that's kind of where I draw the line. For me, when I play a game, I almost require some sort of linearity. I don't like having to explore to figure out where it is that I have to go and wander around in circles for hours. And that's kind of what you do, or that kind of the experience that I had with Ground Zeroes is I didn't know where I was going, what I was doing. I didn't feel motivated to do it. The game looks great, I should say, because you can play it on the PS4 and the Xbox One and other systems now. It looks great, but the sound I'm kind of wishy-washy on. Kiefer Sutherland does not make a very good Solid Snake at all, in my opinion. So I lose less of a connection with the series after listening to David Hayter for, 17 years before? However long it's been. And that hurts. That hurts the series in my eyes. And as much as I want to be interested, as much as I want to continue to give it a try, as much as I want to believe that it's going to be the game that I want it to be, the truth of the matter is Ground Zeroes proved to me that it's not. It's not going to be that kind of game that I want to play. It's going to be, as many modern games are, very open world, very find your own way along, very do things at your own pace without a lot of pushing in a certain direction. And this is why I've had difficult times playing games like Fallout 3, games like Skyrim or Oblivion, even games like the Grand Theft Autos, simply because they're much too massive, they're too large. I wind up doing something on the side, and then I totally lose interest in the story, and then I don't care anymore, and I wind up shutting the game off. The older Metal Gear Solid games never had this. You had some freedom to explore, but you were always kept moving forward. Even if you had to do some backtracking, it was for a reason. And with Metal Gear Solid 5, I fear that's not going to be the case. There's going to be a lot more meandering, a lot more, you can do this at your own pace, or you can do this whenever you want. And for me, I just wind up losing interest. And that's too bad. So that's really where I draw my recollection of Metal Gear Solid to a close. It's a shame, really, that it ends on such an indifferent note, rather than something that I'm exceedingly excited about, as I had been for the past 3 Metal Gear Solid games, and how I learned to love the first one. And that's disappointing. But that's the way it goes. Games will continue to come. I'm sure games in my favorite series will continue to come, and I will evaluate those as I get to them. But in the meantime, talking about Metal Gear Solid, and with this being the last hurrah for the main series, what memories do you have? Did you play the first game at launch, or did you play it later? What's your favorite game in the series? Is it Metal Gear Solid 3, as a lot of people tend to think that it is? Is it an earlier game, a later game? Maybe it's one of the PSP games that I didn't mention. Feel free to leave those in the comments below, as well as some of your own memories of the series, because I'd love to read them. Until the next time, my friends, thanks as always for watching Consolation. I really do appreciate it. And until that next time comes, take care.